Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 247. I'm your host, Cody Goodwin. Got a fun show for you guys here today. I wanted to take one of these shows this week and just kind of tie a bow on Alabama's 2024 season, the highs, the lows, everything that went wrong, some of the things that went right, and just kind of what were the final takeaways from the Crimson Tide this season. So instead of the usual gang, me, Mike, and Alex, I called on John Talty, old friend of Bama 247, who's now a national college football writer for 24/7 Sports and CBS Sports, and a guy that has covered Alabama for quite a long time. Me and John discuss really Alabama's 2024 season. Again, the highs, the lows, what we thought of Kalen DeBoer's first season, how they compared to some preseason expectations that John and I both had, what we felt like went wrong. At what moment did we feel like Alabama might have been in trouble this season? But then also we kind of take a way too early look ahead at Alabama's 2025 prospects, just kind of some offseason storylines that we're going to be monitoring, things that intrigue us coming up way ahead of spring ball, and things that we're going to be paying attention to as Alabama prepares for the 2025 season. So it's a really great conversation. We go about an hour, a little bit more than an hour, but I think you guys are really going to enjoy John's insight, the conversation that we have, the back and forth, really fun conversation. So we'll go to that now. John Talty and I discussing Alabama's 2024 season. I hope you guys enjoy it. As promised, we are welcoming back John Talty, national college football reporter for 24/7 and CBS Sports, and a Bama 247 alum. John, it's been a minute since you've been on Roll Pod, man. How are you doing?
I know. It feels like old time steak here. I'm glad we're doing this.
We are going to discuss Alabama's 2024 season, kind of what we liked, what we didn't like, what we kind of thought went wrong, and then maybe take a way too early look at the upcoming offseason and things that are kind of intriguing there. But first, John, you kind of got to cover college football at large, right? Like not just Alabama, not just the SEC, but a little bit of everything. You wrote a handful of different stories this upcoming season, or I guess during this past season. I know the season isn't over yet. Still got the playoffs to finish up here over the next, I guess, month. What was maybe the most thrilling, exciting, memorable part of this like college football season for you, getting to kind of, tap back into that national role?
Yeah, it was cool. I mean, it was good to just kind of get to some different places and experience some different, fan bases and things like that. I was at Ohio State Tennessee playoff game. That was cool. I think just to experience, the Tennessee takeover, and then just the way that Ohio State just absolutely wrecked them. That was, kind of the high of the build up to it, and then we finally saw what Ohio State could be when they fully let it loose. So that was a good one. But yeah, it was just good, I think, to kind of just see, just how some teams compare outside the SEC too. I've been so SEC dominant for the last decade plus that, covering some Big Ten stuff, seeing some ACC, Big 12 stuff like that, just getting a more 360 look, I think has been helpful for me. But man, it's hard to top the SEC still. I mean, I saw you. Probably one of the last time I saw you was Tennessee. I mean, it didn't go the way Bama fans wanted, but I mean, that place was just rocking. I mean, it's hard to beat atmospheres like that. And I've, that's been reinforced for me as I've gone to other places.
The year and a half I've been in the SEC, it's the SEC, and then there's everything else. And that was kind of the vibe when I was like, living in Iowa, growing up in Kansas City, like the big bad SEC down in the South, just kind of, they were the bullies of college football. But getting to branch out, I guess, like there's, hey, like the Big Ten Conference, pretty, I mean, top heavy, but still, the teams that came out and made the playoff pretty good this year, right?
I mean, they've got two in the Final Four here, right? And the other one got eliminated because two of them had to go against each other in Oregon, Ohio State. I think if Oregon was placed somewhere else, easily could have been in the Final Four as well. So I think that college football has broken down into a lot of Big Ten versus SEC, but there is always going to be that SEC versus everybody. And I think just kind of in part how the playoff discussion broke down, being basically three SEC teams and Bama, South Carolina, and Ole Miss for that final spot. There was just, predictable on both sides of the argument, right? Not that we need to relitigate that, but people who don't like the SEC were out and about. People who like the SEC were out and about, and I think SEC still just moves the needle in such a way that's unique. But I think Big Ten is certainly right there, and then I think it's kind of everybody else after that.
Do you think the most staunch SEC supporters are like uncomfortable with the fact that they have to cheer for Texas this upcoming week in the semifinals?
Yeah, I wonder if we'll hear any SEC chants. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if they've fully embraced Texas quite yet, but you certainly don't want a double Big Ten matchup. I don't think that's attractive, and I think it's interesting too. I'm kind of working on some stories around this. Like, Texas is also just not only just the only last SEC team, but it's really the South's only hope, right? I mean, this is so Northeast dominant. It's North dominant, excuse me. Penn State's Northeast, but then you've got, of course, Notre Dame and Ohio State. So you've kind of got an all North matchup possibly coming up. So I think as an SEC fan, you're going to want Texas to break that up a little bit. But like, do you really want Texas to win it all its first year in the SEC? Like, I don't know if that's what you want. So I don't know. It'd be a good question for the board about, I assume given the alternatives are Ohio State, Notre Dame, and Penn State, you probably want Texas. But just anecdotally, I've talked to a couple of Bama friends of mine, and they're all like, man, all these teams stink. Like there's not really a team for anybody to root for. It's just all big brands that aren't Bama, right? So that's not, a great feeling for them.
I mean, if they really want to latch onto something, like you root for Ohio State because they've had a couple of Bama guys kind of help them get to where they're at, right? Like I know Seth McLaughlin got hurt, but he was an All-American center, and obviously we talked plenty about Caleb Downs last year, and he seems to have taken it up another notch this season playing safety for the Bucks too. So I don't know if people want to do that, but like if you really want to cling to something, like Ohio State's Alabama players have played pretty well this year.
Yeah, and I think the Ohio State, I think, is a good also model that shows like when the fan base does go all in and they do put the money involved and you're actively, adding talent, like it can work out. And I think we saw that. It was touch and go throughout this year, especially with that loss to Michigan. But what I've seen against Tennessee and then against Oregon, like, yeah, that's a dominant team. And that's what happens when you go out and really invest in the roster the way that Ohio State has. And, Texas has done that as well. And so, there's a little bit of a playbook for a school like Alabama of like, if you can invest, like you can add pieces and get to that level.
Yeah, 100%. I think a lot of folks, at least, or maybe I'm just probably more speaking for me now, I kind of thought Ohio State was probably the most talented team in the country this year, and now they seem to be playing like it after, I don't want to say messing around during the regular season, but you could tell they weren't really playing up to their potential. But they have 3 or 4 buttons that they can press that maybe no other team in the country could press, and now it just seems like they're finally rolling on all cylinders. They're hitting all those buttons, and I don't know, man. Like I know that we cover Alabama in the SEC here, but man, they're fun to watch. They're really fun to watch when they're clicking like that.
Yeah, I mean, Jeremiah Smith is awesome. I mean, he is just at another level. And I think, and again, we'll get to this later, but like, that's probably part of the blueprint for Alabama, right? Is like Ryan Williams. And I think that, I know there's a lot of discussion early on. I would put Jeremiah Smith a notch above Ryan Williams right now. But certainly Ryan Williams has that incredible potential. And so can you build an offense that takes advantage of him more? I think that would be part of the key for Alabama. We saw it in chunks. They didn't always go to it. I think part of that was based on QB and matchups and things like that. But, I think just in the last month plus against Michigan, Ohio State doesn't use Jeremiah Smith that much. They look bad, they lose. Against Tennessee and Oregon, they use them a lot, they win. It's not that simple, but sometimes like when you've got the best player on the field, like you get them the ball. And I think we're seeing Ohio State leaning more into that. And I think, if Bama, like I want to see Ryan Williams do cool things. Like we know he is special. We know he can do things that pretty much nobody else on that field can do. Like get on the ball in space and see what he can do.
100%. That's a good transition into what we're really here to discuss on today's show. And that's Alabama's 2024 season, just kind of in review, right? John's been covering Alabama for a really long time, so I really appreciate his perspective. Thought I'd bring him on to discuss the Crimson Tide this past season. Just a quick overview in case you forgot. Alabama 9-4 overall this season. They missed both the CFP and the SEC title game, even though both of them were well within their grasp going into November. Ultimately lost to Michigan in the ReliaQuest Bowl. First time Alabama did not win 10 games since 2007, and 4 losses in the season is the most Kalen DeBoer has ever had in a single season during his head coaching career. John, when you think back on Alabama's 2024 season, what will you remember the most?
I mean, it's simplistic, but it's really high highs and really low lows. I mean, I think that the first half of that game against Georgia, that's the high. I mean, it's hard to top that. I've covered Alabama for a long time. That's about as good as I've ever seen them play in one moment. I mean, they looked incredible. And then even just the way that game finished was an incredible moment of Ryan Williams. The lows, you've got a couple to choose from. I think it's Oklahoma. It's probably the low for me. Vanderbilt was the shock to the system, but I think Oklahoma is more of just like, man, you got to be kidding me. This is, Oklahoma team that was not very good. The fact they lost by the margin they did, the fact that the offense just seemed to make no adjustments and that they just had them completely figured out. That to me was a real wow kind of moment. And just to give a little, behind the scenes journalism nerdery here, like that was, I had done something earlier in the day. I was planning on having my night off. I was actually out of town. And as that started trending the way it did, my boss started texting me more and more like, hey, I think I'm going to need you to ride at Alabama. So I went from like, I thought I had my night off, and then it was so shocking that Alabama lost to Oklahoma that I got kind of like the relief pitcher called back into duty, and I had to write something that night, which was surprising, I think, to all of us. So that one was the one that I think was the one that would bother me the most. And of course, as we all know, that was ultimately the reason why they didn't make the playoff.
Yeah, there was a lot of people that, and especially hindsight and whatever the discourse ultimately turned into after the first round of the 12-team playoff, like people were poking fun at SMU, poking fun at Indiana, like they didn't belong there. They didn't do this. They didn't do that. Alabama had all these wins. Ole Miss had some of these wins. Like, I think Miami probably had an offense that could contend, right? I think there were some people making the argument that you want teams in the field that actually have a shot to go win the thing, which
Sure.
I understand. But also, like, when you look back at Alabama's season, I don't know. The inconsistency of the thing really is what bothered me, kind of like you were saying, the high highs, the low lows. And I could hand wave away the Vanderbilt loss, right? Like there was a fluke deflection that turned into a pick six. They got beat really on one play on offense that resulted in a sack and a fumble, and Vanderbilt played the offensive game of their lives, and it resulted in a win in Nashville, right? And it was a shock to the system, but you look at the way Alabama played mostly during that game, and it's like, I can, as long as they take care of business, like I can hand wave that away. Not dissimilar to Tennessee's loss to Arkansas, right? The difference was that Tennessee was able to go and take care of business, right? Like not only were they able to beat Alabama, but they were able to get to 10 wins. No, they didn't get to Atlanta for the SEC championship game, but Alabama needed to do that in order to maybe earn the benefit of the doubt. And I don't know that even a close loss to Oklahoma would have given them fully the benefit of the doubt. But the fact that it was 24-3 and it was a total no-show, like it's hard to hand wave that away. And I don't know, like I agree with you. That was probably the low moment of the season for Alabama. And I think what stuck with me the most through this season, I'm curious what you think of this. I don't know that I've ever seen an Alabama team this inconsistent, like with those high highs, with those low lows. Like, and we saw last year's team was, they kind of struggled at first to figure some things out. And then after the bye week, they really started to kind of lean into what they were really good at. Like we knew the defense was pretty good. It was a matter of, can the offense stretch the ceiling a little bit? And to their credit, they walked the tightrope, won the SEC title, got to the playoff, and were a couple plays away from playing for a national title. This year's team just never seemed like they had that high of a floor, or at least like that stable of a floor. And I don't remember ever really seeing an Alabama team that was that inconsistent. Like, can you remember another team like that? Or why do you think they were so inconsistent this season?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just like we kind of not took it for granted, but like, under Saban, there was never losses to Vanderbilt. I mean, that just didn't happen. You really didn't have losses to Oklahoma either. I mean, you'd have to, again, go back to probably like 2010 or so for those kind of things. And that was, a disappointing season for Alabama, but they were still really talented. They're coming off a title game, title win. And I mean, I think a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there have been some roller coaster moments with this team. I feel like, some of the things that we used to not see of Alabama, whether it's, dumb mistakes, penalties, stuff like that, we've seen those all kind of crank up over the last couple of years, even under Saban. But to me, it just felt like a team that, played up to the competition and played down to the competition. And I think that I can remember, and I talked to some people about this, I can remember Georgia game especially. Very rarely have I ever seen an Alabama team come out the way that they did. Just even like walking out, I don't know, there was just, you felt like they were so fired up. They were so ready to go. And Saban's talked about this in the past, where like he was always very cautious about having guys too revved up because you're going to burn too much energy too soon. And I think that might have been what happened a little bit. And then the classic rat poison, don't let yourself buy into it. Saban always preached that. They were saying it too. And then what happens right afterwards? They lose to Vanderbilt on the road. And it feels very obvious to think that they looked past that game. I'm sure they did. And so it just felt like more of like what we see other programs have to deal with, but we've never really seen Alabama deal with under Saban. Just the ups and the downs, inconsistent play. You play really well against a good team. You play poorly against a bad team. Like, it just feels like that's more of what we saw under Kalen DeBoer. And something that was pointed out to me, and I'll be honest, I didn't watch a ton of Kalen DeBoer at Washington. When they had that great year, I started watching more and more as it became clear they're probably going to make the playoff. But I didn't watch all their stuff. But what was pointed out to me by a couple of people who played them at Pac-12 and otherwise, that like he had a lot of talent, especially compared to the rest of the Pac-12, and that he kind of played down to the competition at time. And if there were a lot of games that were much closer than they should have been based on talent differential, and that he would let teams back in at the end of the game. And like, they had enough talent that were able to win all those games until, of course, they lost in the title game. But when the talent is closer and there's not as much of an advantage, you can get beat doing that. I feel like that played a role against Vanderbilt for sure. I mean, I think could have beaten Tennessee, certainly. Oklahoma, again, that's just one that you'll shake your head and think about for a while. But those other two feel like easily could have flipped the other way, and that's a whole different season.
Yeah, no, and you make a good point about DeBoer's Washington teams kind of playing both up and down to the competition a little bit. And one of the ideas that I kind of had throughout the season, kind of soft launching here a little bit, is that when you're when you're at Fresno and you're at Washington, it's not, this is going to sound very SEC bias of me, but it's not, you're not playing an SEC schedule, right? Like when you think of the old Pac-12 schedule that they had to play, right? Oregon was really good last year. USC had moments. Utah's always really tough. Oregon State had a really good year last year. They got up for those games and they played really, really well when those games were in prime time, right? Like they beat Oregon twice. They were able to beat Texas in the, CFP semifinals, but then they also 15-7 over a 9-loss Arizona State team, like 42-33 against a Stanford team that finished with a losing record. Washington State didn't have the best year in 24-21. Like, they have this wicked talent advantage in a lot of games that they probably should have won by at least multiple possessions. How many times did we see the highlight of Penix hitting Roma Dunze for the, on fourth down to move the chain so that they could milk the clock a little bit, right? And you can do that when you play a Pac-12 schedule. You can do that when you're coaching at Fresno. You can do that when you're coaching at Sioux Falls and you have 4 or 5 games a year that you really have to get up for, and you can just kind of let your scheme take care of the rest. I don't know that you can do that in the SEC, especially in an SEC where the portal and NIL is really kind of leveling out the playing field, right? Like there was more parity in the SEC this year than we've seen in quite some time. And if you don't bring your A game every single time, like that was Saban's greatest magic trick. Like no matter whether it was Mississippi State or Georgia, Alabama showed up and you were going to get punched in the mouth no matter what. I don't know that DeBoer was fully ready for that this first season in the SEC, and it bit him against Vanderbilt, and it bit him against Oklahoma struggled this year, but that defense still played their tail off all the way through the season. And they were able to kind of disrupt Milroe and cost him. Like, I don't know that he was fully ready for that. And I hope that's a lesson that he would learn getting ready to prepare for his second season. But that was something that kind of stuck out to me a little bit.
No, I completely agree. And I think, Lane Kiffin might have said something similar during the playoff thing that like, it's one thing to have to get up for 2-3 games a year versus having to get up for every SEC game. And if you look, I mean, Vanderbilt, you kind of like wash away a little bit, but like all 3 games on the road, right? And like, I just think that that's another part of it. Like, all right, Vanderbilt's not at the moment was not very good. Tennessee, no excuse. That was a good team. Oklahoma, though, it's like not a good team. Who cares? But like, it's still going to be a rowdy road environment. They're still going to want to win, and that's part of it. And I think, not to skip too far ahead here, but like I was looking at the 24/7 transfer portal rankings earlier, and like a lot of the teams that were on the down rankings have all added like the best transfer portal classes because it's the SEC. Everyone's investing money. And so like I think what we have seen, to your point, is that I think the super elite have been kind of brought back down to earth because of parity. But I think the bottom has leveled up too, that even the teams like Mississippi State was pretty bad this year, but they went out and got one of the best quarterbacks in the market, and they're investing real money to try to be better next year. They might still be the worst team in the SEC, but that's not an easy out for anybody. They want to win. There is a lot on the line for them to win. And so I just think from top to bottom, the SEC is really strong right now. And, adding Texas and Oklahoma just magnified that. And I was looking at some of the schedules for different SEC teams earlier, like, dude, there's a lot of games you'd be like, that could be a loss, that could be a loss. Even teams that you believe in, it just could be a lot more 9-3s in the future.
I wanted to kind of take a step back. This 2024 Alabama team. I'm curious, John, what were maybe, if you can think back, your preseason expectations for this team when you were thinking, back in August, they're getting ready to, gear up for the season, their season opener. I know that there was a lot of hype and excitement around DeBoer. Like, what do you remember thinking were like, okay, if they were able to do A, B, and C, this would be a pretty good season in DeBoer's first year in Tuscaloosa?
Yeah, in my head, maybe I'm a little more on the pessimistic side. I thought 9-3 is kind of where it was going to land. Now, the wins that they had and the losses that they had are not what I obviously imagined. But I thought 9-3 to 10-2 is kind of what I thought. I thought that, coming into the season, I thought Georgia was probably going to be a loss, to be honest. I just thought that was going to be a really hard game for them. I thought at Tennessee was going to be a loss. I just thought that would be really hard. And then I thought, LSU was going to be tough, Auburn, Oklahoma maybe. I thought there'd be a couple of toss-up games, that they would be somewhere in that range. So I think what made it this season challenging in some ways is that because they won Georgia, right? And I think that set the bar so high so early, where it's like they're number one team in the country. DeBoer's got it figured out. He's handling things well. And you just said he had an incredible offseason. Like, all the questions that we had, he's pretty much figured out. They were recruiting really well, retained a lot of talent. They lost some big guys, but they retained a lot of talent, seemed to put a pretty good staff together. He was having a great, kind of welcome tour to Alabama. And then you win against Georgia. It's like, this guy's the king of the state. I mean, it was an incredible moment. And then you lose to Vanderbilt and it starts shifting, right? And then you feel some uneasiness. And then, I mean, you were there, so you can tell me, but just from the Alabama fans that I heard, not that it mattered, but that loss to Michigan has not gone over well with people. It feels like that's, just kind of one of those things, like, people are not out on him, but I do think it's, in a year, it has flipped to some extent. And so I'm not necessarily surprised by the final result. As I said, I'm surprised by some of the specific games. I thought that they'd be in that 9-3 to 10-2 range. I thought that they would have a good shot at making the playoff. They did. They ultimately missed it. Thought that was possible. I thought they would probably get in, but that's kind of where I just thought that they were between losing some of the people that they lost, losing Saban primarily in transition. I just was not a believer of them as a national championship team coming into the season. I will admit that after they beat Georgia, I started changing my tune a little bit, but I think the end result, they kind of leveled out around where I thought they would be.
Yeah, I think, all of us, like me, Rodak, and Scarborough, Bama 247, we all predicted 10-2. I think we all thought they would lose to both Georgia and Tennessee, but we all thought that 10-2 would be good enough to probably get to the playoff, right? And then from there, it's, once you get into the dance, like, we've seen what happens, right? Like, it's, everybody that's still playing played a first round game. So what are buys worth anyway? But we assumed that 10-2 plus a trip to the playoff would have been, thumbs up for the first year. It's the brand new, brand new, like, expanded playoff there. I don't know that we predicted this much parity in the SEC, but we thought, okay, 10 wins. There are a lot of pieces coming back, specifically on offense, right? Like, Milroe was pretty efficient last year under Tommy Rees. And we kind of thought that, hey, we kind of bought into the hype that DeBoer would be able to take them to another level. We can have the discussion about whether or not he ultimately did that and what ultimately that means for this past season. But yeah, we all kind of thought 10 wins. We thought that could be possible. We did think that there were a couple of games that were maybe interesting, similar to you, but we kind of figured they would take care of the rest. At what point did you start you mentioned the Georgia game is like when you started to change your tune, like, okay, maybe this team does have it. Was there another game where you were like, okay, maybe not?
Well, what's interesting is that, again, maybe I'm just a little skeptical or pessimistic, but like before the Georgia game, I watched all their games early on, and I was telling people, it's like, man, I feel like this team has flaws. Like they were winning, but it was just like, I just didn't think anybody could capitalize on the flaws yet. But I was just like, partly like South Florida. I mean, their QB just could not hit open receivers, but like there were moments there. And you remember, I mean, that they, like, if you had a competent QB, that game could have been a lot closer. Wisconsin, they crushed them, but the QB goes down, like the third or fourth play of the game. I mean, it was so early on that, like, it just felt like there's some things that I'm seeing that I don't love, but like they're winning, so it's fine. And then again, they played so well in that Georgia game. And like, what's so interesting about the Georgia game is that, like, you could have focused on it two different ways. I chose to focus on the first half and what I saw coming out of that game. You could have chose to think about man, they really almost blew this game in the second half. And what does that say? But that's not what I was thinking. I was coming out of it very positive. So that was part of it. Again, Vanderbilt was a shock to the system just because Saban's never lost a game like that. So that was, I think, shocking to me. But, after that, like, it just felt like, I would say after Tennessee, I was pretty skeptical of them. And I wasn't really believing. I didn't really care about the Missouri win. I mean, that was kind of like a whatever. But then LSU was really impressive. And that was like, to go at LSU and do what they did, you kind of get sucked back in. And then, of course, Oklahoma happens. So it's a lot of like, I'm out, then I'm back in, then I'm out, then I'm back in. That happened to me a few different times this year with this team. And it was you dealt with it every day. Like, it's kind of like half full, half empty. Like, there's so many things that you could choose to focus on the positive or the negative. Like, I'm sure our guy Rodak might have been more on the negative of what he was seeing. You might have been more on positive, but you could be staring at the same thing and just lean different ways. And like, it kind of played out more negative, but like at various times you could have gone either direction.
I think I stayed mostly on the positive side through the Georgia game. And even honestly, like even through the Vanderbilt loss, like I was still like, you know what? Like they moved the ball. The defense wasn't great, but like you can see where they can start to maybe fix some things. And then from that point forward, I thought the defense played well enough to give them an opportunity to, get where they wanted to go. What really bothered me, and I'm curious, I don't know if you remember too much about this game, but really it was honestly, in hindsight, the South Carolina game was kind of like when I was like, all right, like that kind of rattled the cage a little bit because that was when it was, and we saw this a little bit last year, but really not a ton. And so maybe we're kind of loosely giving Tommy Rees a little bit of credit here, but that South Carolina game, that was the first time that Milroe, when he got pressured, and this is not a unique thing to him, it happens to college quarterbacks all over the country every year. But when he got pressure on him, it wasn't that he struggled. It was that it was really hard to kind of reel him back in. Yep. And that's what, like, it was during that South Carolina game where I was like, because they had Dylan Stewart, Kyle Kennard coming off the edge, and the tackles struggled a little bit, and they disrupted Milroe, and they got him out of a rhythm. And it wasn't that they got him out of a rhythm. It was that when they got him out of a rhythm, it was really hard for Milroe to get it back. And it was one of those things where it's like, when this dude gets punched in the face, he has a hard time coming back. And I didn't like that. And clearly that played out in the Tennessee game because they did fine. And then Tennessee's defense settled in and punched him in the face. And that was more or less it. And then we all saw what happened against Oklahoma, right? Like it was probably that moment where I was like, if things don't go perfect, things could get really bad really quick. And that's ultimately what we saw.
Yeah. And I will give, I will say, when we were talking earlier about kind of how this season played out, South Carolina is probably the biggest surprise to me. I just did not believe they were as good as they proved to be. That was certainly surprising to me. But you're right. In that moment, especially, that game, in hindsight, it doesn't look as bad in some ways just because South Carolina started beating other teams. But in the moment, you're like, it's not a good South Carolina team. You expect them to kind of, beat up on them. And I think that's also one of the things that was a bit surprising to me. Again, it eventually kind of happened in Missouri, LSU, but you're kind of waiting. All right, you lost to Vanderbilt. Like, let's turn it on. Let's step it up. Let's see it. And then then you're seeing games like that. You're like, maybe these guys just don't have that next level. Again, we saw it in a couple other moments, but yeah, that was definitely a concerning one where it ended up being okay for them just because South Carolina finished the season 9-3 regular season. But in the moment, especially, it was like that was confusing. And again, they easily could have. I mean, they should have won that game, and they did win that game. But there were multiple times at the end where it's like, all right, if you just do this, it's over. And then they kept finding ways to not do that. I still, I was lost at the end.
Yeah, I was going to say, it wasn't just Milroe there too. Like they did not. I don't want to say they didn't, win the game, but they didn't. I don't know that they fully tried to win the game because there was that moment near the end where I think it was Jeremy Bernard scored a touchdown, and he was wide open on the far side of the field. And if he'd have just gone down, Alabama could have milked the clock and won the game, and South Carolina would have never touched the ball again. But instead, it became a big thing, and they had to, I think it was Damani Jackson who picked it off and ran out the clock before he finally took a knee on the field afterwards. But they shouldn't have been in a situation like that to begin with. And it kind of goes back to the whole, I hated making this comparison, so I tried not to over the course of the season. But Saban's teams knew how to just close and win the game. And that was at least one example where it's and I think it was, afterwards, Rodak asked the question to DeBoer, hey, were you aware that if Bernard didn't score and just went down, they could have ran the clock out, South Carolina would never touch the ball again. And I think it was Jeremy who said, like, we were always taught to score. DeBoer said that I'm paraphrasing here, but basically, like, he didn't really think about that at all in the moment. Like, he just kind of wanted his guy to get a touchdown. Like, hindsight's 2020, but like, that's when the light flipped that we were just like, okay, like, this is different. This is not a Saban coach team. I hate making that comparison because they're two different guys, but yeah, that's when I could tell that something was just a little bit different and something was probably going to bite this team.
And there's some weird late game stuff against Tennessee too, where you're just like, I don't know, just felt like some weird strategy stuff. Just didn't feel like that team had it all figured out and knew what to do situationally. And again, even some of the play calls from DeBoer I thought were a little iffy. But yeah, that's just and again, yeah, in some ways it's unfair, but like that's also why he makes $10 million a year. And that's what he signed up for. Like, he will always be compared to Saban. That is just the reality of what it is. And especially year one, I think it's fair. And, we'll see what ends up happening, but we all remember what it was like. And so that's what you're going to compare it to. I don't think that's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah. I think over the course of the season, Alabama's defense, it took a minute, but they rounded into a unit that at least gave this team a chance to get where they wanted to go. The offense was ultimately the unit that fell on its face against Oklahoma, fell on its face in the bowl game that, you were talking about. Some people are not going to hand wave away the bowl game. I'm willing to do that because it's a bowl game. It's not a playoff game, whatever. But I wanted to have the quarterback conversation with you, Jalen Milroe. What did you think of the way he played this season?
Well, I was playfully texting your colleague Alex about the timing of his Jalen Milroe column of the bowl game and how that played out. I felt for him there. Again, he's just one of those guys where I think he has his defenders. I think he has his haters. I'm probably somewhere in the middle. I think that he does things very well, and there are moments. Famously, I think you compared him to Charizard on a previous podcast that we were on. I think there are moments when he does things you're like, this guy's really good. And then he does things that you're like, this guy, I think is kind of selfish. And I think that he just is not always doesn't always have the best decision making, I think, in the moment. And so I believe, based on people I've talked to, that 2 years ago that Saban would have loved to have not had to have started Jalen Milroe, but I think he realized that was his best shot to win. And I think if you talk to people around the staff this time around, I think there is a world in which they would have loved to maybe not have had to use Jalen Milroe either, but there was just really no. You could say you could have benched him, and I think maybe there are moments where against Oklahoma or Michigan you should have or could have, but I think with a guy doing what he did the year before, the fact they came, a play or two from being in the championship game, I think they would have won the championship game. No offense to Kalen DeBoer's Washington staff. Like, I think that you had to start him this year. I think we all knew from day one. I feel like you and I probably talked about it. I know I talked about it with Alex and Rodek at various times. Like, really from the moment Kalen DeBoer got hired, I think we all thought it's going to be an awkward fit. I think it's just like wasn't necessarily what Kalen DeBoer has succeeded with in the past. I think that we know the growing pains that Tommy Rees and Alabama had of Jalen Milroe. So I'm not necessarily surprised by it. I think that you would have hoped, I think as you said earlier, given the offensive background that Kalen DeBoer has, like that he would have found a way to get more out of Jalen Milroe, whether that's changing what he does or changing what Jalen does. And unfortunately, I think as we come to the end of the season, Milroe's still kind of what I thought he was. He's very athletic. He can hit some big passes. I think he's still reliant on just kind of one look and then moving on. And I think he's still kind of a selfish player. So that's just kind of, I don't know that my opinion has evolved that much on him, in part just because that just seems to be where he's ending things off on.
Yeah. And I think what really frustrated, me covering the team and also fans who, love this program, there was a lot of excitement with DeBoer coming in, and I know Grubb didn't ultimately come with him, but Nick Sheridan did, and that's a guy that he's had with him since their Indiana days. And, they saw what DeBoer did with Peyton Ramsey and Michael Penix at Indiana. They saw what DeBoer did with Jake Haener at Fresno State. They saw what DeBoer did with just Michael Penix back at Washington. And it's like, okay, like this guy is kind of a quarterback whisperer. He can at least get the most out of his quarterbacks and maybe help them level up in ways that maybe they previously didn't with past coaches, right? So you pair him with the guy that finished sixth in the Heisman Trophy vote in the year before, and it's like, okay, like cautiously optimistic, right? Because there's also the player element of this, and what more can he give? What more can he do? Like, how does that marriage work? The cautious optimism on my part was, I got bit, right? Like I bought into it, and I paid for it a little bit because just watching this team, and I think a lot of it, and you even mentioned it, you didn't watch Washington game for game last season, but you started paying attention as, they're winning games and they're 8, 9, 10-0. They're beating Oregon twice. They're getting to the CFP semifinals. Like, you start to see what that offense can do, and you see how good it is when they have a quarterback that can do all the things that DeBoer wants him to do. And it became very clear probably during that South Carolina game that Milroe cannot do all the things that DeBoer wants his quarterback to do. And that really limited the offense. It limited the use of guys like Ryan Williams and Jeremy Bernard, right? And, I used the Charizard comparison last year. He fully evolved into this fire-breathing weapon. I'll give Alex Scarborough a lot of credit for coining. This was he's James Harden playing college football, right. Jalen Milroe. And sometimes he's going to take 20 shots a game and he's going to make 15 of them and he's going to score 40 points and everything's going to be hunky-dory. Other times he's going to take 60 shots a game. He's going to make 10 of them and things are going to go haywire. The offense is going to go through this guy for better or worse, and Alabama's going to have to live with that. And again, hindsight's 2020, but that South Carolina game's when I started thinking, okay, maybe this offense doesn't have as high of a ceiling as maybe we previously thought during that Georgia game, or, even in the loss to Vanderbilt, the offense was still very, very efficient. And it was really during that South Carolina game where I was like, this could be some trouble. And I think what really irritated, again, me as well as Alabama fans, is that this was not really the Kalen DeBoer offense that we saw tear it up at Washington. This was not the Kalen DeBoer offense that turned around Indiana for a year. This was not the Kalen DeBoer offense that Jake Haener turned into an NFL opportunity. This was the Jalen Milroe offense. And that was frustrating for a lot of people. And this is kind of looking ahead a little bit into something else I wanted to ask you about. But I do wonder, with Milroe now headed to the NFL, and now there's, a three-way battle. Really, I think maybe, Ty Simpson's probably the front runner to be QB1 starting in the spring. I wonder how much a different type of quarterback with a different type of skill set is going to allow us to maybe see the full Kalen DeBoer offense this upcoming season. I'm curious what you think of that.
I think it's the biggest reason to be bullish about the future is that, to your point, this was not what we've seen from him at the past when things were all, kind of guns blazing, and that whether it's Ty, Austin, Keelan, grabbing somebody from the portal. I mean, I'm a Ty Simpson guy. I've been a Ty Simpson guy for a while. I still think that he, could be successful in that offense. I've never seen Austin Mack. I've heard good things about him. I mean, we'll see what he does. And, of course, Keelan's coming in as a true freshman, but people obviously think very highly of him. But you would think that one of those guys will fit better into what Kalen DeBoer wants and what he's excelled at in the past. And I think if you combine that with Ryan Williams taking a leap, switching Jalen to that side of the ball, some of the other guys that you're bringing in that can the offense level up, I think it's possible. I think that's, if you're still buying Keelan DeBoer stock, I think that is the reason why you believe that this can work. Now the concern would be that next year, whichever one of those guys it is, if the offense does not take a leap, then I think you're going to start wondering, okay, what's going on here? And that's when I think you'll see fans start to panic a bit if they're not already. So I think that's very much make or break. I do think it's interesting, not to backtrack, but I would say the biggest concerns I had about the team coming in were really defensive. And here we are talking so much about the offense, which is, again, Kalen DeBoer's bread and butter. So I think it's fascinating, but I also do believe we see this all the time, and I don't want to get into hot seat stuff. It's way too soon for that. But I do think ultimately when you see coaches get fired, it's because the thing that they specialize in does not look good. And that's, I can stay in state, whether it's Gus Malzahn, Brian Harsin, whatever. If you're an offensive guy and the offense looks bad or does not look as good as it should, that's when it seems to really crank up pressure. And so I think Kalen's going to get judged on a lot of things, but if the offense doesn't look good, I think that's really going to be a problem for him. And so I think next year is pretty, not to put it important in that regard. And who he chooses, I think, is critical to start, whether it's Ty, Austin, Keelan, player to be named later. As you know, I was also a big Dylan Lonergan fan. I did, probably too crowded of a room for it ever to be him, but he's my dark horse. I think he's going to be good at Boston College.
Yeah. Well, hey, he's going back with his guy, Bill O'Brien.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think things will work out pretty well for him. Before we move forward into kind of looking ahead real quick, We did spend a lot of time talking about the offense. The defense, though, I did kind of want to get your thoughts on the defense overall. Just it was Kane Womack's swarm defense. I think there was a lot of curiosity coming in. One, because of all the turnover, especially in the secondary, right? I think they only returned one starter of the five guys that were there. But two, like, can this swarm defense work in today's SEC? And I think my perspective, at least, it took a minute, but once the defense was really kind of, once they figured out personnel, once they figured out certain sub packages, once they really figured out what Kane wanted, I thought they did really, really well. They were taking the ball off people. They were limiting opposing offenses. I thought that, he was able to kind of mesh the concepts he wanted with the talent that was still there, even though they lost a lot. And I thought the defense was, I don't know that it was a championship level defense that they were last year, but still a pretty good unit. Like, what do you think overall the way the defense played this year?
Yeah, it's hard because that's like, again, like Alabama fans are so used to how Saban did things. And so that's like the number one thing that they're like, all right, like this is different. I don't like it. And then the minute it goes bad, they all freak out. And so I think Vanderbilt clearly did not look good. I think everyone was understandably upset about that. I thought that they did enough against Tennessee to win that game. They shut down Missouri, shut down LSU. Oklahoma was interesting. I think they got caught off guard, and I don't know how much of that is that on Kane Womack. Clearly they were not expecting Oklahoma to run Jackson Arnold the way they did, and how they structured that offense. And again, is that a preparation issue? Is it just sometimes that happens to you? It's interesting. I think Rodak has had the theory that with Georgia, like flip side offensively, that like that first half, Kirby Smart was just not expecting to see what he did, and then he adjusted. That might be a pessimistic view of it, but I do think that happens sometimes where like you've just never seen something before and you get caught off guard. That's what it felt like to me in Oklahoma. So that one's a little hard for me to judge on like who to blame for that. Certainly, you don't love the final result there, but I think there were definitely improvements over the course of the year. Again, I think they lost so much, like you said, that I was almost expecting worse moments along the way. Like I thought they did. I was worried that Carson Beck was going to light him up. That did not happen. I mean, he had a very good second half, but they made plays when they had to at the end. I thought they did a pretty good job again against Tennessee for the most part. So I think there's positives to take away from it. There's a lot of good young talent there. Again, you hope that they take another step. And clearly, Kalen DeBoer's already made some staff changes. He believes that changes needed to happen, and he is going to a guy who he knows extremely well, who he has worked with at pretty much every step. And so you would hope that maybe there's even more improvements there with Kane not having a position group anymore, can focus holistically on what the defense has. Kalen obviously trusts Chuck implicitly, and I think maybe we'll see some even more improvements. There's going to be growing pains when you have that big of a shift in terms of personnel and scheme. There's going to be growing pains, and I think we saw those. But to your point, I think by the end of the year, it felt like they had turned a corner in a positive way for the most part.
Looking ahead now, Alabama's off season. I mean, it's kind of already been underway, right? Like with the bowl game ending the time we're recording this a week ago, the portal has now officially closed for Alabama outside of like graduate transfers. We'll see if any more sneak in. I guess that now that they've got some scholarship room, we'll see ultimately who they are able to pull out of the portal or who they want to pull out of the portal. Spring football is going to be here probably in about a month and a half or so. I'm curious, John, just from your perspective, what's maybe the most intriguing part of Alabama's upcoming offseason? I know the quarterback battle is probably going to take the cake here, but is that really the biggest thing, or what else kind of intrigues you as we look ahead way too early 2025 Alabama?
Well, I think offensive line is crucial for that too. I mean, I think there's obviously so much that could happen there. You're losing some really veteran guys. I mean, Tyler Booker, I think has been the heart of that offensive line. It's a hard guy to replace. I think there's certainly talent there, but I think not only who is on the offensive line, but also, what's the kind of the lineup. We've seen Kalen, make some shifts. We saw Saban having to shift guys around that kind of last year. So I think is pretty important to me. And I think I would still like to see them add some pieces. I think Alabama's strategy is interesting. They've clearly invested most heavily in high school recruiting, which I think is probably a pretty smart way to build long term, of course. But I also think that with the way that college football is now, I think he's probably doing that out of a place of strength. But I also think that if they're not good next year, they're probably going to have to hit the portal really hard next year. because the pressure is going to be cranked up crazy. So I would like to see them maybe be a tad bit more aggressive in the portal, maybe splash a little bit more money there and not just on high school and retention. But I think they've done a good job, certainly, of getting. I'm trying to think of out of the borderline guys, it feels like they're getting almost all of them to come back, which that takes money to do. And so I think that they clearly have a strategy, and I think that it's not to be super aggressive in the portal, but there's just there've been times in the season where you're just like, man, I wish they had one more weapon here or one more piece here, and like that's it's your time to shop, but all that's expensive. And I think that as we've talked about plenty in the past, Alabama has come a long way in NIL, but they're still not quite at the top percent.
Yeah. Well, and you look at the teams that are still playing, right? Like there's clearly an investment in high school recruiting, but there's also those portal guys to shore it up. Like we were talking about Ohio State earlier, right? Like they've got the Jeremiah Smiths, they've got the Cody Simons, they've got, most of their offensive line, but then they also went and got a Seth McLaughlin. They also went and got Will Howard. They also went and got Caleb Downs to kind of shore things up, right? And those are, those aren't just anybody's. Like those are all pretty well blue chip guys to go get and kind of, plug in the final pieces. And Alabama's kind of doing that a little bit, right? Like the pass rush wasn't really there. They went out and got a Kelby Collins. They were able to kind of recruit LT Overton back. Sure. They were able to recruit Tim Keenan back. Now the middle of the defense is, we saw some transfer portal departures with some younger linebackers because Deontay Lawson's coming back and Justin Jefferson got the JUCO waiver. And, now they're bringing back Damani Jackson at corner. Now the secondary looks really, really experienced. Right. And, receiver, they had Ryan Williams, they had Jeremy Bernard. They went out and got Isaiah Horton. Right. So can he be that kind of consistent third guy? I think they really like what they have in Josh Cuevas at tight end. So then maybe there's your fourth guy. And, I also wonder too, that's the portal discussion. To your point about the offensive line, I'm curious what you think here. Does the change in quarterback style, right? Because whether it's Ty Simpson, whether it's Keelan Russell, whether it's Austin Mack, probably going to be a little bit more of a traditional drop back passer back there starting in the spring. Do you think that helps the offensive line, or how do you think that maybe impacts the way that they're able to kind of, figure things out up front?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think in theory, you would think it could help a guy like Caden Proctor, right? I think so that it does change. I think what you do, and I think again to go back a little bit, I think why Jalen Milroe has been the starter the last 2 years has in part been based on the offensive line personnel. I think again go back to South Florida 2 years ago when they tried to play Tyler Buckner and Ty Simpson. And it was like, nope, can't do that. We need Jalen Milroe to bail us out of these experiences. And so it does. It definitely changes. I think it changes what you recruit and changes how you build. And clearly they have invested the high school level and otherwise. Like they're investing a lot in the offensive line. And, I think you believe long-term that they know what they're doing. It's another one, you mentioned Ryan Grubb earlier, but that's another spot where, thought you had a guy and then he goes to Seattle and you have to hire somebody different. And so, there have been some adjustments there as well. But, I think that's based on the personnel. I think that's certainly something that, if Ty Simpson's back there. And I do think, he's the classic sneaky athletic guy. But I do think Ty Simpson I think he can do a little bit more with his legs than people give him credit for. But you would think, generally speaking, with the guys that you have, I agree, probably more traditional than what Jalen has been for sure.
Yeah. And I just wonder if that style of quarterback back there is probably a little bit more of what DeBoer's used to when you look back at the quarterbacks he's had. Penix, Haener, Peyton Ramsey was a dual threat-ish kind of guy, but, they still tried to do a little bit more traditional drop back when they were at Indiana. So, I just wonder how much that maybe unlocks the rest of DeBoer's offense. And maybe do we see, 4, 5, 6 more pages out of that playbook than maybe what we saw this past year, because they, clearly as the season went on this year, again, kind of backtracking here, they really kind of pared down the offensive playbook to center it around Milroe, which, people are like, why didn't we see too much Ryan Williams in the second half of the year? It's like, well, when you have to pare down the playbook and it has to go through the quarterback, you're going to do a few more runs just to make sure that the ball is protected. And sometimes that means a few less deep shots, which is obviously what Ryan Williams specializes in. And that's that's at least part of it, right? The other part of it is probably a little bit of a freshman lull. Like he had a few more drops in the back half of the season than he did during the first half. So, a few different things at play there. But I think having a little bit more of a passer that DeBoer is used to having, a guy that can drop back, can make more of the throws, can maybe go through the reads a little bit more confidently, but in Ty's case, does have a little bit of playmaking ability. He can get out and create something if you need him to. It's not like the thing at the top of his, profile, I suppose, but it's something that's in his bag. I just wonder if that'll help unlock a little bit more of the offense.
Again, I think if you're being optimistic, it has to, right? I think, like you said, they scaled it back. We did not see all of what I think we could from Ryan Williams. I agree. Like, I'd be curious, if he looks back on it, whether he thought he might have hit a little bit of a freshman wall there. Because, I mean, he was so good so early on and was used so often that, naturally that's going to wear you down a little bit. He's, as we all remember, he is 17 years old. And so eventually that I think can catch up to you. But that would be my hope is like, again, get him the ball more often and open up, you don't want to keep comparing it to what we've seen in the past, but that 2023 Washington offense was really, really good. And again, there were multiple NFL wide receivers on it, but I think Ryan Williams is an NFL wide receiver. And so use the guys you have and try to get opportunities to maximize what you have. Because as young as he is, like, I think you're probably getting 3 years of Ryan Williams unless something really changes. So year one's done. You got 2 left. Like, how do you get the most out of that guy before he has to move on to the next level? I think that's critically important for Kalen DeBoer.
We've talked quite a bit about reasons for optimism or reasons to maybe keep buying stock in Kalen DeBoer and Alabama moving forward. What's maybe a reason that you maybe have, again, way too early when it comes to pessimism, or why would you maybe sell stock a little bit?
Well, I think it's what I think we hit on earlier. I think, it's SEC is very hard to win in, and I think we saw the ups and downs. Like, can they be more consistent next year? I have questions around that. I think quarterback's a wide open thing. I think, again, we're all expecting somebody who seems to fit the profile he wants more being better and maximizing that offense. But is it possible that those guys are worse? I think it absolutely is. I mean, again, for all of Jalen's faults, there's some pretty special moments too. Like, is a Ty and Austin and Keelan going to deliver some of the things that we saw against LSU or Georgia or the year before? I think that's a question. And then, I think sometimes people figure out a little bit, like, I think the Swarm defense is going to get better, but could it actually go the opposite way as more people are familiar with it? I mean, you can find negatives either way. I think that the one concern, actually, now that I think about it, that I do have is that I feel like they have lost a lot of depth. And I think that's impacting everyone across the board. But if you look at what they've lost to the portal, it's a lot of former highly rated guys who didn't really play that much, but still pretty young. I think that can hurt you long term just because you're not developing those guys. But B, if a guy or two goes down, do you have the talent to slide in? And I think that for the most part, trying to think off the top of my head, I don't feel like Alabama was really hurt that badly by injuries. There were a couple guys, but like they, I think, got lucky in some regard in terms of their top guys being, for the most part, pretty healthy. Outside of Keelan Sabb and a couple others, like if you lose a couple of those guys, do you have the talent to slide in? Again, I don't think that's unique to Alabama. I think that's every program right now is losing that top kind of depth that they had. But when I've seen what they've lost in the portal, that's the one thing that concerns me just a little bit is that, it's hard to retain those guys. They want to play, they want money, all those different things. But it just feels like you're losing some of those guys that in the past would have slid in or, 2-3 years in, finally have developed enough. Tim Keenum takes a couple years and then they really take off. I think that would be part of my question with them. What about you?
Whoever's starting at quarterback, you're going to have a first-year quarterback, right? So that's
Yep.
How quickly can you bring them up to speed? What does the spring look like? Like that's, I think you always maybe start there, especially when you're talking about DeBoer and his offense. I do agree that defensive depth is a question mark. They've lost a handful of guys at key positions specifically. And part of that is because they've got key guys returning, right? Like we've seen, I think over the last couple of days, a few like interior linebackers hitting the transfer portal because you've got D-Law coming back. Justin Jefferson's coming back. They went and got Nahai Hill-Green coming from Colorado. He's all Big 12 defender. So like you have your, and that kind of forced Justin Okoronkwo, for example, right? Like the guy from Germany, he's now in the transfer portal, right? And that's a guy that I think a lot of us were really high on. He had a pretty good A-Day last year. The interior linebackers, there wasn't really a lot of opportunity there for him, but we kind of thought, okay, what's the turnover going to look like? Is he going to get to play? We thought so. And then Lawson comes back, JJ comes back. So then it's like, okay, this kid wants to go play. He's clearly good enough. I also wonder, they haven't really had a pass rush the last, I guess it was really more this season because they had one of the best pass rushes last season, but they change up the defense. It's a swarm defense now. They don't quite have the same personnel, and the personnel they do have not quite used the exact same way. Like I think you can make a pretty strong case that their best pass rusher this past season, at least like on a down-to-down basis, was probably Jahad Campbell, but they used him a lot more as an interior middle linebacker. And he made himself a lot of money this year. Like, he's on his way to the NFL. He's a great player. I loved watching him play this year. But he wasn't always rushing the passer. Like, they were, they had him doing a million. He was kind of the queen on the chessboard this year. So, that also raises the question of, now that he's gone, who is going to be Kane's queen on the chessboard this year? Also, they brought LT Overton back, who was great from a pressure standpoint, not really great when it came to finishing to get sacks. Can you take that next step and turn those pressures into sacks? Does the addition of Kelby Collins help that? Like, there's just a couple of like little minor things here that I thought the defense was good. If they can add a pass rush on a more consistent basis, they could probably go from good to great. And honestly, like, we'll watch spring ball. We won't know if those things are answered until week 1. And even then, it's only week 1, right?
No, I think it's a great point. I think the pass rush in particular, like, I don't think it's been good for years, to be honest. I mean, it's had moments, but I think, like the last time I've thought about like when they've had truly game disruptor type guys, and like Will Anderson was certainly one of them. But that was a calling card for Nick Saban's defenses for a long time. And they went downhill under Saban. I think the last few years, whether it's recruiting, missing on guys not fully developing, they just have not had the talent and the depth at that spot. But if you think about some of the defenses that gave Alabama problems this past year, South Carolina, they have some game records up front. Tennessee, really good. I mean, you go a year back, Texas. I mean, Texas has some great guys. Georgia usually does. So I do think that is a key area that elevates a defense. It makes it a lot easier for the guys in the back if you're getting pressure up front. And we know just from an NIL standpoint, like, guys who are good at those positions get like 7 figures, like that's, and we see the NFL too, that's where the money is. And so, I do think I think it's a really smart point by you, that I think that's a spot where they have not been as good as they've been in the past. And, that would be crucial, I think, for them taking a step forward, is like, if you can get more pressure. I think your LT point is dead on. I mean, just what he finished with, like 2.5 sacks. I forget the exact number.
It was something low like that, but he had like 40 pressures on the year. Like, he was consistently getting in the backfield. He just wasn't finishing.
Yeah. So, I mean, him coming back, I think, is big. I mean, I think, what was it, a month or two ago? Like, he was a guy, like, not that they matter, but like in the mock draft world, was a kind of like projected first round guy. Like, there were moments this past season where you thought he might be going to the NFL. So I do think he is important to get back, especially if he can kind of, again, take a step forward next year.
Yeah, 100%. Before I let you go, give me one bold prediction way too early on 2025 Alabama.
Wow, that's a great question. I don't want to. This is going to be a bad listen if I just take 2 minutes to think of an answer here.
Well,
I'm trying to think of what I think is bold.
If you need time to think of one, I'll give you mine.
Yeah, let's hear yours.
So think back to not that you would have watched this team, but 2019 Indiana, when DeBoer is the OC. He had an experienced quarterback in Peyton Ramsey, but they also had a superstar freshman, Michael Penix Jr. And for damn near all that season, they kind of ran a dual quarterback system. When in some of the bigger games, when they need a little bit more veteran presence, they leaned on Peyton Ramsey a little bit more. But generally, they played those two guys all the way through the season. So now you're coming into 2025 Alabama. You have a guy that we think is all pretty talented in Ty Simpson, but you've also got the number 2 overall prospect in the country coming in Keelan Russell. And he has said on multiple occasions, I'm coming there to compete. Like, I'm coming there to compete for the starting job. It would not shock me at all, again, way too early, if there's similar little dual quarterback action there, a little bit of Ty Simpson, maybe lean on him and his experience a little bit more, but also we might see a lot of Keelan Russell in 2025 as well, especially if he's as good as we all think he is. And when you're the number 2 overall prospect in the country, chances are you're pretty damn good. So that's my bold prediction.
No, I like that. And I'll say I give Kalen DeBoer and his staff credit, because I think Brett will get mad at me if I botch this. If I can remember correctly, I mean, he was ranked, was he a top 100 guy when he was committed to SMU, and then he flipped? Like, I mean, he was a guy that people knew, but they got in on him seemingly like the perfect time. And I can remember hearing from other people, he was like a 4-star guy. It was almost people not making fun of Alabama, but a little bit like, oh, like, cool, you're stealing a guy from SMU, like, way to go. And he just clearly just had an incredible senior year. And as you said, now he's ranked where he is. And so that's I give them some credit for the scouting report. That is, like you said earlier, even though it didn't quite work out this past year with Milrow, like I do still give DeBoer a lot of credit as a quarterback developer. And so like that's one of those where it's like same thing I feel with Lane Kiffin and other Sark, like whoever they want at QB, I trust that guy is probably pretty good. And so that the one question that I have, this is not a bold prediction, but related to it, it's like, what do we think Austin Mack becomes? Like he's such an unknown mystery to me, but the fact that he came over so quickly is similar to be like, DeBoer has to know something about this guy that he wants him so bad, knowing that his arrival also cleared out Julian Sayin, who's probably going to be the starter at Ohio State next year. So I don't know, maybe like I think that the QB battle is so fascinating to me because I think I can talk myself into almost all of them. I still will believe in Ty Simpson because I've been beating that drum for like 2+ years at this point. I have to stay committed to it. But Austin Mack to me is the number one wild card. So I might talk myself into Austin Mack being the starter. Maybe that's my bold prediction. I don't really believe it in my heart, but I'm trying to come up with something. I just think he's such a mystery. His size is intriguing to me. And the fact that DeBoer wanted him to come over, it just lends me to believe there's something there. But I haven't seen it really.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's, you talk about how intriguing this quarterback battle is going to be, and it's probably going to be the offseason story for this Alabama team. How these three guys kind of figure out the pecking order in the spring is going to be really, really interesting. And then also like, as they continue to go through fall camp and really ramp up for the season, like I'm going to be really intrigued to follow that just for, a lot of the same reasons, right? Like you kind of have a guy who we think has the inside track in Ty Simpson. You've got one of the most intriguing players in the country coming in Keelan Russell, but then you've also got Austin Mack just kind of hanging out there. And like he early enrolled at Washington. He followed DeBoer here, like in a blink. What does he have to offer? I don't know. It's going to be really intriguing to watch that competition unfold over the next, 6 months.
And how you balance that battle is crucial. Now, if you think Keelan's the guy and you want to turn the keys to him, hey, great. We trust you. Go for it. But that clears out the room, right? And so I think how that's going to be I think Keelan's the one that you probably don't worry about as much, but guys transfer. I mean, there's a kid who signed, enrolled, and already transferred because he felt like, from Oregon to Cal, because he felt like at a couple practice that he wasn't going to be the focus next year. So like, again, traditional, experience would say, hey, Keelan can wait a year or two, let the other guys go. But like, I don't know, maybe not. I mean, so I just think like how you try to convince all of those guys that they're in the mix and competing, but they're not. Nobody wants to be number 3 because if either Ty or Austin think they're number 3, I think they're probably out of there, right? And so like Keelan's the guy who makes the most sense there, but then maybe he gets anyway. It's gonna be that's where like really like that's how you earn your bucks, right? Because I think that like you would love to have all 3 of those guys go into the fall, really open competition, best man wins, and then if whoever it ends up being, you're going to have a really great backup if things go wrong or you got to switch or yank him or whatever. You want to hold on to that room. You don't want to lose any of those 3 in the spring, especially knowing that like inevitably there will be a team that will want to tamper and steal one of those 3 guys. And so how DeBoer manages that, I think is really interesting to watch. There'll be plenty for you guys to write about.
100%. Yeah. 2025 Alabama is going to be all the more intriguing, and perhaps even way more intriguing than 2024 Alabama, which was maybe one of the most interesting Alabama teams in recent memory. So, John, I appreciate you coming on Roll Pod to discuss Alabama. We're gonna have to have you back on soon to maybe after spring ball, after we learn a couple of things about this quarterback room. We'll bring you back on and fire off some hot takes.
Would love that. I'll cook up some takes between now and then, and they'll be ready. They'll be ready to come out of the oven by April.
Hell yeah. Big thanks again to John Talty for literally taking an hour out of his night to discuss Alabama's football season with us. I really appreciate his insight and his conversation and just kind of the way he views these teams. So just a little bit more from that national lens where he kind of has the big bird's eye view, but he's also, a guy that's been covering Alabama for a really long time. So I appreciate his insight and just the experience and expertise that he brings to a conversation like that. So hope you guys enjoyed it. We will be back later this week. It'll be me, Mike, and Alex discussing a little bit more about the way too early 2025 Alabama. We're going to discuss some of the transfer portal news, some of the guys that they were able to keep, some of the guys that they lost, what we think about some of those roster management things that kind of went down over the last few days, and just things that we're looking ahead to as we kind of navigate the quote unquote off season for Alabama ahead of 2025. So that'll be later this week, probably looking for Thursday for that show. In the meantime, be sure to rate and review this show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 247 and 24/7 Sports. The offseason really only just beginning, guys. We got a lot of roster management stuff coming over the next few days and few weeks. And before we know it, spring ball is going to be here in a blink. And I don't want you guys to miss a thing. So we put a link to that in the show notes. Please go subscribe. Promise you won't regret it. As always, we appreciate you guys for listening. We'll talk to you all again soon.